we'll spend a little bit of time, just the introduction to what transportation impact analysis applications are typically used with Vistro. Brief thoughts on scenario planning, and then we'll take a look at, kind of quickly existing conditions, building up some background traffic condition scenarios before we add on our own projects, trip generation, distribution, and assignment. After that, we'll look and evaluate our network and look for areas where we might need to provide some mitigations. Once we identify and go through some mitigations, we'll look at the fair share reporting tools that are built into Vistro in order to help identify the project responsibilities for those mitigation measures. After all of that, we're gonna really highlight these 11th hour changes that often happen for those of us who are in the transportation impact analysis report generation field, when we're especially working with private developers who may be modifying things as we are most of the way through our process, and how Vistro really can benefit you in terms of efficiencies and time savings when those inevitable changes do occur. And then towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about some other extensions of using the trip assignment workflows within Vistro, whether it's for area-wide analysis, quick peek at some VMT calculations you can do, also maybe using it for some other purposes besides development impacts. All right, with that, I will switch. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into our study area for today. What you will see in front of you is a Vistro network that has a defined existing PM peak already built. You can, as you've been following along in these series, we covered setting up your existing networks in previous webinars. So following those types of steps, you can get to this level where you have your scenarios of your original base scenario, as well as your existing PM peak. And so as we think about the types of typical impact analyses that are done for developments, and we start thinking of similar types of scenarios that you may need to analyze, we can think about what else besides existing PM peak. Do we jump from an existing PM to add the project right away? Do we try to account for other growth that may be occurring in the area between the time that your counts were taken, which is represented in existing, and then the time that the opening day of the project, which may be 2 years from now? And so that's typically a case where there'll be an intermediate scenario. I'm going to call that a near-term scenario today, where we'll account for things such as background traffic growth and also take into account some traffic from another nearby project. If we zoom in here, we'll see we have a number of different intersection types. And as I zoom in closely, we can see this particular plot here in the lower center part of the network view is where our project is being built and the project that we're going to study. It's a large family fun center with some retail and fast food pads as well built in. And as you can see in the surrounding area, a recently built strip mall, also some other areas where land development is expected to occur over time. So with that, we can think of our first next scenario. In this case, we will call that and build our new scenario off of our existing PM. The purposes of simplicity for the 1 hour webinar, as well as even the land uses that are utilized here in this development, the AM peak is going to be skipped. A lot of land use studies will have an AM and a PM peak. This particular generator, really, there's not a ton of AM peak hour trips based on land use types anyway. So we're going to focus only on the PM peak hour and work us through a set of scenarios for that. An extension of this later on, it could even be that maybe this particular land use type, you do a Saturday midday, something like that as well. With that in mind, let's go ahead and build our next scenario. So if we go to the scenario pull down menu and I highlight the existing PM, I can toggle this down arrow, which is the duplicate scenario. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that. We'll see that created a copy. I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this my near term PM and hit enter. Now that I have that defined, I will just left click it To make that my active scenario, we can see that that scenario is active in the white bar. So anything I do now will only affect this particular scenario. There are two things that I want to accomplish in this case. One is to apply an overall growth factor for all of my background traffic. Just as a reminder, if we click on any of our intersections in Vistro, we have our other workflow tables for intersection setup, volumes, traffic control. If we look at the volumes menu for a moment, and we can scroll here and we can see our different base volume inputs. We can also remember that we can see these on screen by posting them. But ultimately, there's a field here called growth factor. And under existing conditions, of course, we did not have a growth factor. Now I want to apply a 2% per year growth factor throughout my study area. The easiest way for me to do that is to go to Edit, Multi-Change. And in that, I can pick an attribute called growth factor. And I can put this in. I'm going to be fancy today. Instead of just 1.04, representing 2% times 2 years, I'm actually going to do the 0.0404 just because we can. So we'll have that as our growth factor. Here I can pick which intersections I want to apply that to. In this case, it defaults to all being checked, and I'm going to leave it that way. And I'm going to hit apply, and it'll tell me that it's updated that growth factor at 241 movements. I'll hit close, and on this screen, I'll see that that growth factor has now indeed been updated. And again, because I did this under the near-term scenario, it's only being updated here, not under existing conditions, so that's great. The other thing that I want to account for is even though our project, we will generate the trips internally within Vistro, we do need to account for one other nearby project up in this site location. And just as an example of what that looks like, I have a little schematic here. I just copied and pasted the network into PowerPoint and threw in the project only trips from a different study. This is an approved project. Just as a reminder, our project site is to the south. I just drew these right at the project driveway, but of course they would also find their way throughout all of our study intersections. So we can see there's 55 inbound and 25 outbound PM peak hour trips for this approved project that I also want to layer onto my existing count data, because while the project is approved, it hasn't yet been built and was not then accounted for with my traffic count data. So there's the quickest way to do that in Vistro is to utilize, if I were to come to this project driveway, for instance, and look back on my volume field, there is a row called in process volume. And this is where I would come in and I can enter those particular turning movements. Reminder from some of our previous webinars that in Vistro you can import volumes, but first you have to export. So if I go to File, Export, and click Values, I can pick the in-process volume as an option and export that. That will create an Excel file that I can then edit, and it will have all my turning movements in their appropriate place. So just as an example, and to save time, I've already done that. And I would have exported out of Vistro a table like this with all zeros. And you can see here that I've gone in and edited those particular volumes for my in process to reflect that additional development. Just to highlight briefly, I just color coded it here just so we can see only the red values are the ones where I'm actually going to assign those other project trips in my network. By doing it in the table, it makes life pretty easy. And so then what I can do here is go back to edit and back to file. And now I can import, and I can import my in-process volume. And when I do that, you can see that that brought in those turning movements to reflect that additional project north of my site. And so it did that not only at the project driveway, but if I were to zoom in now and turn on my in-process volume turning movements, then I can see, the 20 out, the 35 and 20, so 55 in, 20 southbound right, 5 southbound left, and then how those fan out through my network for in process. So again, just building up the case of a near-term project scenario. The idea being basically that before I add my development trips on, I want to account for what traffic conditions would be like equivalent to day before opening day for my project. So to do that, I added a growth factor and added my nearby approved traffic. So now we're ready to start talking about our projects trips. Okay, so now we're ready to start talking about our project trips and start to talk about the new elements within Vistro that we're going to utilize in order to account, to generate, distribute, and assign those project trips to our network. So the first thing I want to remember is that I want to create a new scenario. So in this case, I will pull down my scenario manager. Since I want to build off of my near term, I'm going to use that scenario 2 near term PM to duplicate. So I'll duplicate that. And I'm going to rename it, and I'll rename this near term plus project PM. And then I want to remember to actually left click and select that scenario. So at the moment, scenario 3 is exactly the same as scenario 2, but I'm about to make changes to include our new project. Couple thoughts. One, if I knew all I was going to do is ever have a PM with project case, I can add my project information directly into this scenario. And what I mean by information is we're going to utilize some new tools from our toolbox. Zones, which represent the land uses. Gates, which will represent the external points of our network where our trips will start from or end at, depending if it's an inbound or an outbound trip. And paths, which will connect those zones and gates together. So if this was my only with project scenario I was ever going to have, I can go ahead and add all of that just into this scenario. However, it's more than likely in a real life impact analysis that you're going to have more than one with project scenario. So my recommendation is that we add the zones and the gates at least back in the base scenario, so that way they're available to us on multiple scenarios that we may want to analyze as part of our real life project or even as an extension of this example project. I also have a site plan for our project that I'd like to put in just to help us see the project a little bit better. So I'm going to do a lot of that work momentarily back in the base scenario. I'm going to flip back to base. Remember, the base scenario is a very special scenario because it can do things there that will apply elsewhere. So what I want to do is under the network, if I pull down this map layers, there's an insert background image. I'm going to click that, and I'm going to pick my site plan. And the site plan will come in, and then I can zoom out a little bit, and I can just kind of scale that manually here. We have things where you can actually set a scale if you want to, but I'm going to use the roundabout and eyeball this right about where it belongs in my network. And then the other thing I'm going to do is right click it, and I'm going to lock that background image in place. Now when I move around, I'm not going to move the background image. So the background image is in, as I described. We have a fun center. We have some pads with the retail, pad with fast food with the drive-through. So, you know, this is, okay, so a little bit of the OCD here. Let me just go ahead and make it so the driveways actually line up with the roadway network, and then I'll relock it. All right, so at this point I have this in, and the other thing that I want to do is put in my zones and my gates. Now, it's up to you when you do your studies. You could have one zone represent your complete development, or you can have many zones represent your different land uses of this particular development. There's pluses and minuses of both. Single zone makes it quicker to do your trip generation. There's quicker to do your assignment even because there's fewer paths. But the strength of having multiple zones is that you can track the different land use components differently. So whether or not you want to give different trip distribution characteristics, in this case, these are all retail basically with some restaurant. we're going to use the same distribution patterns, but let's say I had a use case where I also had residential units, and the residential trips may have a completely different trip distribution than my retail trips. That would definitely be a case where I'd want to have more than one zone so that I could make sure that I use different distribution patterns for the retail versus for the residential. So in this case, just to make it pretty straightforward, I'm going to go ahead and add a zone for the fund center. So to do that, I click the zone tool, and then I come in, and if I have a background image, I have to well, nothing like a good software demo to have things hang up on you. I wonder if it's because I locked the background image. Nope. Well, what I want to do is pick the zone from the zone tool, and there we go, double click. It becomes a purple circle in my network here. So zone 1 will be my zone for the fund center. I'm going to click another zone, and even though there's 3 different pads here for the retail, I'm just going to do one zone in a representative area. And then I'm going to do a zone here to represent the drive-through. Maybe I was going too fast before. I'm rarely ever accused of being too fast. All right, I'm going to lock the background image. All right, so now in this case, I have my zones that I've put in for my development, but what I do need to do is allocate some gates. The other thing I can do here momentarily, since I'm not even using my tables, so I can expand my network view. So what I'll want to do here is add gates, and gates again will be my origins or my destinations of all my trips along the perimeters of my roadway network. So I'm going to go ahead and start at the north and work my way around clockwise. You can do it however you want in reality. Gate, and I'll put a gate. Actually, if I click this and I hold down my control key, I should be able to keep it active. So I'm going to put a gate on the north, a gate on the east, gate on the south. And let's see, we'll do a gate on the south on the state highway, gate to the west on this local road, and a gate to the west on that local road. And then I'll deactivate my gate tool. So now I have my 3 zones, I have multiple gates, and I've done this all in the base scenario, so these can be available to me if I decide to have more than one project scenario later on. With that, what I'd like to do is get ourselves out of the base scenario before we start editing anything. So what I'm going to do here is simply hide the site plan. I can do that under map layers and click the change visibility button. That'll hide that site plan momentarily, and then I'll flip. Now if I were to go back to, let's say, the near term no project, the zones are kind of there, but you can see the site plan's not showing because it's hidden. But then I can come to the plus project scenario that we're going to build on. And at this point, if I go back, I can unhide the site plan, and then it's available to me. The only way to store that site plan in my Vistro file is to put it in the base scenario. And there's a little description of that here. So that's why I did that. But you can see through some quick edits of hide or unhide, you can make it visible or not under a particular scenario. Okay, so we've added zones, we've added gates, but now what we need to do, those are network elements. Now what we need to do is get into our workflow tables for trip generation and trip distribution and then trip assignment. So on the workflow table, I'll click trip generation. And this is the one table where it really makes sense to view and switch your table position so that you can see the entirety without having to scroll. Basically, at this point, I have a format of a trip generation table that follows typical trip generation rate formatting. And you can come in and you can name your zones, and you can put in all your trip generation data and so forth. And all of this, I'm only going to edit one manually. We'll call this a fund center for zone 1. All of this I can highlight and paste, copy and paste into Excel, or I can sit and do it manually, that's fine, but it's not so interesting during a webinar. So what I've done is I've created a trip generation Excel table here with the same column format. And what I'm going to do is just come in and I'm going to grab my information and then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to Control C and I'm going to Control V. And basically what I will input here for my 3 zones, names, fun center, pad shops, fast food pad, very interesting. I just, not getting paid by Panda Express, let's say, so I'm not going to put their name here. But anyway, you get the idea. And then we can put in some description of these variables, an ITE land use code. These are all descriptive. You do not need to have this information. It's really just to round out the nature of the file and for your information or any reviewers' information. Later, we'll show an example where I just hardwire some trips instead of a rate, but typically you're doing rates. We have a rate per an independent variable. In this case, it's per 1,000 square feet. If it was housing, it would be per dwelling unit. If it was a hotel, it would be per occupied room. And then we have our quantities. So the fun center is 95,500 square feet. And since it's per 1,000 square feet, then I divide by 1,000 and put 95.5. I have a 49% in, 51% out, and then we start to see some italicized numbers. The italicized numbers mean that these are calculated in Vistro. It's just simply taking the quantity times the rate times the in percentage to give us this trips in. Same thing for the out, and we see what our totals are here. Also, just for future extensions, you can just simply uncheck any zone under any particular scenario, and it will not generate trips. So you can have a larger file with many zones, and in certain scenarios, you can have those zones active, and in other scenarios, you can have it not active just simply by unchecking the thing. And in the rare case that you wanted to have a negative trip generation, we do allow that by having a removed trip type instead of an added trip type. And that can come in handy, maybe not in these greenfield developments, but when there might be a redevelopment occurring where the original development was still operational when your traffic counts were taken. And so you should get some credit for the old land use. So just keep that, store that in the back of your mind. But basically now we have our trip generation data. And we can go ahead to the next step in the process, which is our trip distribution. For this one, we're going to go ahead and click trip distribution, and we're going to view our normal view here. Pull this over, give myself a little bit more room. Essentially, this creates 3 mini OD tables, if you will, of sorts, each one with the there we go. Each one with a different header in here. Zone 1's fun center, zone 2 is the shopping, zone 3 is the fast food. And in this case, what I'm typically doing, while you can do other things with advanced topics, for typical case, I want to distribute to and from my zones, to and from the gates. And so here I can give these gates names if I wanted to, like Highway 99 South or whatever I want to call it, but I'm leaving it gate in this case. And what we'll do is enter our trip distribution. So if I click this cell, you can see now this is zone 1 to the fun center. So it's an inbound. There's a little arrowhead here. It's an inbound. If I click on the other side of the table, it'll be the reverse of that, the outbound percentage. So in this particular case, my trip distribution patterns are going to be the same, both inbound and outbound. And I'm going to use the same distribution patterns for all of my land uses. So to the north, 10%, to the east, 20, to the south is going to be 20, and to the south on the state highway is going to be another 20, to the west on the first local road, 15, and on the second local road, 15. And you can see when I add those trip distributions in, I get that its total is 100. For this particular case, like I say, I'm just going to simply copy and paste these to have my reverse directions the same, and I'm going to do the same distribution patterns for all 3 of my land uses. Again, if I had like a office or if I had residential, then I would probably be entering different distribution percentages here. But at this point, I'm using the same distribution percentages for my complete development. You can see it already is giving me a bit of the trip information. So for instance, if I click here, let's click on one we can see a little better. From the southern part of the state highway into my site is 20% of my trips, which turns out to be 26 trips. What I haven't done yet is I have not defined exactly how these trips are going to make their way to my development. So I know the general distribution, but I haven't told it how to assign. So again, what makes a Vistro model different from a travel demand model is that this is an additive assignment process that gives you complete control over where those trips are going to be added to your network. And it's meant for, a certain scale of study. This one definitely falls into that. And what we're going to do next is, besides our trip distribution, we're going to go ahead and tell it how to route that traffic. The way that we would do that is by drawing paths. Paths will connect from the gate into the zone. And I'll show how to do some of those manually in a few minutes. However, what we really want to take advantage of are some of the efficiencies that Vistro has built in, which is automatic path generation for us. So since I have trips generated and distributions defined, wherever I have a trip generated and a trip distribution defined, Vistro will go ahead and create an automated path. If you're ever doing a study and for some reason you don't know why an automated path didn't happen, it's because either you didn't have a distribution defined or a trip generation defined. Okay, so if I go to the next tab in our workflow, it's trip assignment. I will go ahead and click that. And it's nice, it's very nice. It tells me there's no paths defined, and it gives me this hot button here for add missing paths. So once I click add missing paths, we're going to get overwhelmed for a minute because there's going to be a table that shows up with all kinds of data in it. But I'm just going to say, fear not, take a drink of your coffee. It's all good. We're going to go through it all one by one. And it's actually a really nice table that interacts with like all Vistro tables, interacts nicely with the network graphics as well. So again, because I have trips defined and I have distribution patterns defined, now I'm going to go ahead and click add missing paths. Okay, well, I just remembered one thing I forgot to do. And so I'm going to do the undo button. Like all good software demonstrations, I will tell you I did that on purpose, and you can choose to believe me or not. One thing that I didn't do was I didn't modify access to my site. So if we would have started looking at the paths, they would have been a little screwy at this point. I would end up with trips coming in from the other leg because there's no leg here for my site. So what I need to do only in this project scenario is I need to go into these two project driveways and allow access. So I'm going to click, right click, add a leg. If I click back on that intersection location, go to, let's say, my network setup, we'll see it only adds an inbound leg. So if I right click at the end, I can edit these and it'll automatically get created. But the other thing I can do is right click at this and add a through lane going the opposite direction. And I just quickly want to make sure that I have access to my site. So, my southbound can now go through as well. My eastbound can now turn right as well. So I'm going to allow that to happen. And my westbound can now turn left as well. So I'm going to update that. And now I have full access at this project driveway. There's one more project driveway for me to consider. That's over here. I'm going to right click, add the leg, and I'm going to right click, add a through lane. And I'm going to add my modifications to all of my approaches. So here I'll let this go everywhere. Southbound. Eastbound and westbound. Now there's one other thing I need to do. I see that it flipped where my stop signs were on me. So I need to go over here to the traffic control table. And I just need to change my north and south to be my free movements. And we can see that visually here. So my driveways are the stop signs, and I forgot to do it back at this first driveway. So let's do that as well. All right, so now I have my access into and out of my site at my two project driveways. I have my traffic control and the correct orientation. All right, take a deep breath. Now we can go over to trip assignment again. And now we're ready to add these paths and we'll get some accurate information. Let me just zoom out for a moment. That's far enough. I will go ahead and add the missing paths. All right, so now what I get is a table. If I click on any row in this table, I'll see the updated path. The path is in red. We look at this table, it has a series origin and a destination. So in this case, origin 1, which is the Family Fun Center, the destination 4, which is the state highway to the north, and there will be automatically created for me at least, well, one path between each zone and each gate. So as I just use my keyboard arrow and kind of scroll through, I can see these paths that got automatically generated. What I need to do at this point is to stop and think, are these accurate? Or am I seeing enough movement out of both of my project driveways, for instance? Am I seeing traffic utilizing the roadways in the way that I want them to? Or do I need to add some secondary paths? And so it's quite common that we might need to add some secondary paths. Let me just go ahead and, for the moment, look here and say, for instance, coming in from the east, I have, well, this is outbound from the east, right? And it's using this driveway. I might want to add some that uses this driveway, or I might want to have some paths that continue through this roundabout up to the signal and turn right. And this is just really where it becomes project specific based on your particular cases. So at a minimum, I want to add some of my traffic to the second driveway. So let's go ahead and do a secondary path just to show that momentarily. So I'm just going to click. It's always nice to click off of the path before you try to draw a new one. So I'm going to click the path tool, and I'm going to start at my Family Fun Center zone and left click that. See, I get a dashed line until I actually get into the network. So I'm going to click that leg. And at this point, I can scroll and zoom, and I can click to press my center mouse wheel to pan, scroll it back to zoom out. I can go all the way here, click, get to my last leg handle, and then get to my gate and double click, and then zoom back so we can see what I just did. So this will create the secondary path that uses this driveway instead of the other driveway. It groups them together. So if I click here in the table, I'll see the first path, click below it, I see the second path. So driveway 1, driveway 2. What I need to remember at this point is I don't want all 100% on driveway 1. I want something like 40% on driveway 1 and 60% on driveway 2. You see that stays red until I get to 100% cumulative for that zone and gate pair. Now I just manually went through the process of adding that path for the outbound direction, but quite similarly, I may want an inbound path that is like that. First, let's see what our inbound path is from, in this case, origin 5 to destination 1. So in this table, I'll go origin 5, destination 1 is right here. I'll click. We'll see in that particular case, the path used the signal, came down and entered this driveway. So I definitely want to also have a path that uses the second driveway. So I'll go back to this new one I just did. Instead of having to draw a new path, I'll just right click it, and it says create reverse path. So I'll click that. And now what that did automatically down here, you can see it says reverse direction, is not only do I have the first path for inbound, I also now have a secondary path for inbound. That's the reverse of the one I just created. I do need to remember again to update my shares or my splits. So again, here maybe I say that this particular is a 40-60. The other thing in this table is once you enter your path percentage, because it already knows the trip generation and the distribution, it'll multiply that by the path percentage and give you your trips. So you always have access to see the actual volumes that you're talking about. So this particular path represents 10 vehicles coming in from that gate into this particular land use. So I think you get the idea. There's a lot of these that I would want to go through and make sure that they make sense. Another one is from this zone here, or from this gate here, it shows the right turn to my pocket, or in this case, going outbound and doing it that way. What is it, 7 to 1? I'd be interested in that. So 7 to 1, it shows the same thing, but I may have people parked up by this other driveway and they would actually be using that other driveway instead. So, you'd want to create some other paths for that. So I promise this is my last path that I'm going to create, but basically I'll do that and work my way over, and then you'll really get the idea of what this is all about because you'll have seen it twice. And now from 1 to 7, I have using the second driveway, and I'll just want to update my splits. Maybe I do 70-30. And then I create my reverse direction. For 7 to 1, I now have the second driveway being used, and I do 70-30. This is where, as I was mentioning before, if you aggregate your zones, you'll have less work to do. So in this case, I needed separate zones for the trip generation characteristics. So I've already aggregated them as much as possible, but it's exactly why I didn't want to put 3 zones in to represent 3 different retail uses, because that means I'd have 3 times the work for doing the paths. So instead I have 1 zone to represent all 3 of these land use components. So that's that. The only other way around that would be if I did my trip generation entirely outside of Vistro, came up with a lump sum trips, and then just use a single zone to assign those trips within Vistro. Then that would minimize how many paths that I need. But it also takes away a lot of the inherent integrated nature of Vistro that we're talking about, and that I'll show later when I talk about 11th hour changes, and also might make it harder for reviewers. So that's something to think about with that. So we've worked our way into building our WISP project. We've generated trips, distributed them, assigned them, cleaned up the assignment a little bit. In a little bit, we're gonna take a look around and see how things are operating. But all right, well, the next thing that I wanna do is briefly talk through looking at the traffic conditions with the project and also looking at some mitigations. I wanted to also mention a couple of things. I'm sure we'll get some questions about this. There are within Vistro now, if I go back and as we start thinking about results, I can pick any of my intersections as an example and go back to my volume, which is a nice table to look at for this purpose. And I can go in, there's a section called TIA demand. And this is a section of the volume table with a little arrow. If I click that, it just kind of hides those rows. The data is still there. If I'm doing anything other than a study where I'm generating traffic, I don't really need to see those rows. But once I do generate site trips like this, these rows are nice to see, and I can verify that in-process volume that we had added under the base case, and then I can start to see in italics some of our site-generated trips. So these are our project trip assignments at this particular intersection. I can also see those visually if I were to zoom in by getting close and picking my option of my net new site trips. So that's a way to visually see what you're seeing here in this table. But you'll also see we have a couple other things that we can accommodate. Most common would be a pass-by trip option. Pass-by trips with certain land uses, including some of the ones that are in our project, like the fast food restaurant or gas stations, for instance, are pretty common. And the way that we handle those in Vistro, I'm going to turn that off for a minute and come back, is essentially as we generate our traffic, because it's going all throughout our network, we want to generate only our primary trips, which are defined as the non-pass-by version. So you may be interested in this or have done this. If you've done this, you know what I'm talking about. If not, it's something for extra knowledge or homework. But basically, certain land use types like fast food, there will be a number of trips that are already on the roadway that will now come in and utilize that. So they're not going to be new trips to the whole network. So we modify that in Vistro at the driveway level. And so basically, for instance, if I had 20 trips that were heading north at this project driveway that are now going to come into the driveway, utilize the fast food, and then come back out of the driveway, then I handle that in in the Vistro table here, make sure I'm on the right intersection. I handle that, for instance, here by saying that I'm pulling 20 trips from my northbound through, and I'm adding them to my northbound right to bring them into the site. And then likewise, my westbound right would get 20 trips, because general assumption is that all those trips happen in the same hour. And then so it comes in and it pulls from the through, comes in, comes back out and adds to the through. So if you took a little count south of the site, driveway, or north of it, the background traffic would be the same. You were just intermediately pulling them in to utilize the drive-through and then going back out. So that's how we handle pass-by trips, and you only do that adjustment at the driveway, because everywhere else, by generating the primary trips, of course, my trip generation rates need to be appropriate, right? So we don't have time to go into all of that today. But that's the way you can handle that. You could get fancy and even do diverted trips if you have from other roadways in your network where you're going to divert that trip over. There may be certain projects where that's the case. You can do it in a similar fashion. And another big topic that comes up a lot has to do with internal trip capture, because we may have multiple uses that people will come in and use at the same time. So they may go buy something, also grab lunch, and also go to the Family Fun Center. So there are different trip generation resources, namely through ITE, that helps you identify which of these uses can, amongst them, how you would go ahead and do an internal trip capture calculation correctly. And then mathematically, to account for that in Vistro, there's a number of different ways you can do that too. So it's just kind of personal preference. You can reduce the trip generation itself. You can essentially reduce your trip distribution. So you're only distributing trips external, and your internal distribution, it kind of lops it off. So instead of distributing 100% of your trips, you're distributing 90% of them, or whatever it might be, based on what you determined from your internal capture calculations. Or even a little tougher, but you can do zone-to-zone distribution within Vistro, but it gets tough because there has to be a conservation of trips. So 20% of this land use quantity is not the same as 20% of this land use quantity. And so it gets a little bit more difficult to keep track of. The calculations are done automatically, but in terms of your own thinking about it. So 3 different ways you can handle internal capture within Vistro. All of them can work. It just requires you to be thinking about how you're going to do them and apply it correctly. So if you have any further questions, it's kind of an advanced topic. We're happy to answer those on a one-on-one basis, and kicking around the idea of an advanced TIA webinar sometime for the future. But that's just to address those topics. Now to get back on to our schedule, we're going to evaluate and mitigate. So I can go through and I can look at each intersection individually. Or I can print my report and pour through the reports. That's all well and good, but a nice thing to do initially in Vistro is just take advantage of some of the things we can post on screen. So maybe I can post my average level of service. I can see how am I doing here in my level of service for my added trips case. I can see that I've got some two-way stops that are not doing all that great. That's not always surprising, because we have a lot of Main Street traffic. For instance, this is a major arterial connecting a couple different suburbs, and so people coming into town, it's going to limit how much gaps are available for the side street traffic. And this one's shopping centers back and forth. Okay, maybe we want to look at that. But really, this one over here is concerning to me because this is near here. I have a couple signals. And then I have this two-way stop, and almost this street is becoming more heavily used, especially as there's additional land uses like our project being built in this area. So one thing I might want to do is run a report. We haven't talked about reports yet in this webinar. We have in the past. If I go to File, Print Report, there's a lot of different options on how I want to configure my report. But one of the reports that we have is we'll talk about fair share later, is a signal warrants report. So since I want to look at these two-way stops, maybe I want to see, is it even meeting the basic volume warrants? So I can uncheck everything else and run just a signal warrants report, which I did in the essence of time ahead of time. So if I pull that report up, And if I go back over here and for the moment just post my intersection numbers, this one is intersection 14. Over here was intersection 17. Those were two that we were thinking about what we might want to do for mitigations. So with 14 and 17, let's go ahead and look. 14 is the one that I was most concerned with, and as I see in our warrant reports, peak hour warrant is met. We estimate the 8 and 4 hour based on some NCHRP rates for spreading volumes throughout the day. Those are met as well, and so this gives me an indication that a mitigation measure I might want to look at is signalization in this particular case. If I look at intersection 17, if I scroll down here to intersection 17, I'll see that I'm not even meeting these peak hour warrants, let alone any of the others, of course. But if I'm not even meeting these, then it's I'm not going to use that as a mitigation measure to investigate at this point in time. So let's focus at intersection 14. And I'm just going to switch back to show my control type. I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to click that intersection and highlight another workflow table that we have within Vistro. All the way to the right is one called Mitigation. If I click that, it starts with a tab called Unmitigated, and this is a condensed version of our previous traffic control table. If I make changes in here, it will change the results on the network, and it will be saved that way. But what we have is a special little plus button. When you click this plus button, it gives you an option. You can think of this option as kind of like a scratch pad or a sandbox, whatever you want to call it. It's a way for you to mess around and see what kind of mitigations you might want to do without actually having them affect your network. And you can have multiple options where you test out. So if you're working on 3 ideas, you can have 3 different tabs that you create as 3 options, 1, 2, and 3. You can start with option 1, and then you can duplicate option 1 and then add other mitigations to it. So like, what if I add a northbound right? And then what if I add a northbound right and an eastbound right? And you can just kind of duplicate your way through. And all of these options can also be printed directly from this window instead of running a full report. So all I'm going to do here is just show that quickly I can come in. I can change this even from a 2-way stop to a signal. And if I do some basics like we've done in some of our previous ones, all these are running off a 90-second cycle. So I'm going to want that. And I can use our default signalization tool. And this is, we don't have a ton of time here, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but it does show that we can confirm that it met volume warrants at least, and we can turn that level service F intersection into level service B if we can signalize it. That may just be one thing we want to continue. At the top, it keeps our unmitigated summary, so we know what that was, and then as we scroll down, we'll see what our mitigated summary is here. So this is just an idea to show a way to use the mitigation measure. Another thing I could do for mitigation is I could create a whole nother scenario. I could duplicate this scenario and I could call it plus mitigation. And then instead of using the mitigation tab, I can just edit it right in the network. So it's really up to you how you want to do things, but this is a handy tool to have this mitigation tool available for you directly as a workflow item. So that's the mitigation. One thing that often comes up when you're mitigating is who's responsible. So I don't know, any Seinfeld fans out there? I know I'm dating myself at this point in time, but one of his things was, responsible. Nobody wants to be responsible, because what's the first thing that happens when something goes wrong? Somebody comes in and says, who's responsible? So anyway, that's going to happen when you do your mitigations. Who's responsible? In this case, we have one developer, so I think we know who's responsible, but sometimes you have more than one developer, or you have a case where, should that developer have to pay for all of the mitigation, or there's, an underlying background consideration. So if we go back to our print reports, and I'm just going to run all these real quick. I want to highlight the fair share reporting that we have. Let me just see what name I'm going to give this thing. Yeah, new TIA report number 2. All right, so we're going to run this. And since this is with project, we're going to be able to see some cool reports. The fair share reporting is a nice one, because it'll allow us to see at every turning movement, at every intersection, what the composition of our traffic is. And so that traffic can include background traffic, of course, and it can include site-generated traffic. Within Vistro itself, in the table for volumes, you can see the aggregate number, but not until you get into the fair share reporting will you be able to actually see the volumes by zone. And what's nice about that is then you can allocate fair share contribution by zone. And you can also do that based on different developments, or whether it's part of just the net site trips, or if it's as part of the future total. So for instance, if we go here and look at, let's just say intersection 1, for instance, within Vistro, we would have been able to see 34 new left turns within the network, but with this report, I can see that 20 of those are from the Fun Center, 8 from retail, 6 from fast food, and then I have a total volume of 190. So using that example, if I move down to the percentage, I can see what my percentage of new trips are by zone, and aggregate it up for each zone at the intersection total over here, or by percentage of total trips, and of the future total. And so we can see so much less percentage when you include the background volumes, for instance. The other thing that's nice with the fair share is in our in addition to all of our other graphical reporting, we can do fair share volumes. The zone that's being shown gets enlarged. So number 1 is what this is about. And then basically you get bubble diagrams that are project only trip assignments, essentially, at each turning movement, visually or graphically for number 1 throughout my intersections, throughout my network. And then I'll see here, if I scroll down far enough, then I see number 2 gets larger. So these are the project only trips at all my intersections for project 2. And not only do we have the trips, but we also have the fair share percentages as diagrams as well. So that can help you immensely when you're doing these studies and trying to allocate fair shares. But basically, one of the key things that I wanted to make sure that we address here is the integrated nature of Vistro. So I'd like to, I at least personally coined the phrase years back that was 11th hour changes have met their match. And so what I mean by that, if we look back at this scenario that we have already in place, it has been a really long time since I saved the file, but basically what I would want to do is show that if for some reason in the 11th hour I get input from my developer, if I'm doing a consultant study, that all of a sudden they can make a larger project, or they want me to do some scenario testing of alternatives, because everything is already built in, all my background volumes, all my distributions and path definitions. I can simply come into the land use area, the quantity. If this 95,000 became 105,000, I simply update the quantity and hit tab. And when I do that, in that simple update, all of my trip assignments have been updated that quickly. So now if I were to go back and look at all of my project only trip assignments at all of my turning movements, they would reflect this larger trip generation. And I can do that for any of my land uses, of course. And the next time I run my reports, I would get all new report data as well. So what used to be a huge pain if you're doing this kind of stuff in multiple software programs and Excel and bringing it into another analysis program is very easy when you have to deal with the inevitable changes because of the integrated nature of Vistro. I'll put that back to its original state and switch this back. So the only other thing I would add is you can see maybe in a future webinar we would cover some advanced options. This is an area that's growing. There's other land that can be developed. One thing we can do is we can utilize this, and others have been doing so in certain locations, where instead of a project only or project specific analysis, we might do like a sub area analysis where we keep this active and we can analyze multiple sites using this until such time that this project actually becomes part of the background volumes because it's built. So Vistro can be expanded for beyond a single project site. And lastly, I know there's a lot of talk about VMT these days. And while it's not a full demand model to get you full VMT, one cool thing that you can do in Vistro a lot of times you're dealing with just scenario testing anyway, or what's the incremental change. So in our trip assignment table, we have the volumes and the links. All of this can be copied and pasted. We're looking to add this feature eventually, but in the meantime, you can simply paste that in like I did here, all the stuff in black. I created a row called VMT where I basically take the volume, times it by the length, divided by 5280 feet per mile, and come up with an actual VMT for that particular path. And if I do that all the way down, I can see I have 396 PM peak hour trips that generate 423 VMT. That's the net new. And so if I had multiple scenarios and I wanted to compare, land use program 1 versus land use program 2, or with or without this particular project, how that might change my VMT, it's a pretty easy thing to do, taking the data out of Vistro's trip assignment table and doing that short calculation by adding another column.